All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Bryce Covert. Bryce is a writer for The Nation magazine and Think Progress. You can find all of her work at brycecovert.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at Bryce Covert. Bryce, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, so Bryce, most of us are watching the horrors unfolding in Ferguson, Missouri, after a police officer killed an unarmed teen, Michael Brown. You actually have a report up at Think Progress on how racist housing policies are actually helping fuel the anger that's happening in Ferguson, Missouri. Tell us all about the policies.
Yeah, I think it's important when we're looking at what's going on in Ferguson to take a moment and take stock of the history of this area, particularly the economic history, because I think that has a lot to do with why there is so much anger and so much unrest on display among its residents. The St. Louis area, which is where Ferguson is located, is the ninth most segregated area between whites and blacks in the country. So it's a highly segregated area, and we can trace the history of that segregation back through into the earlier part of the 1900s, when there was a combination of federal housing policies as well as sort of actions being taken by local real estate agents to segregate the white and black communities. So it was something that was being done by real estate groups that was then sort of backed up by the government. And what we see in the St. Louis area, it starts in 1923, really. The real estate group starts these unrestricted zones in the city's historically black neighborhoods where real estate agents were allowed to buy and sell to black people without restrictions. But everywhere else, they considered it basically malpractice to sell a property to a black person. So anywhere outside of these zones, if you did so, you could lose your license. That sort of gets rolled up into one restricted zone in 1941, and they start using covenants as well, which basically means that they have decided that you cannot buy and sell properties to black people in the vast majority of white areas. That can only happen in certain areas. While that's going on, then the government sort of then backs this up, and this is something we saw across the country in many, many cities, but definitely happening in St. Louis during the New Deal. There were government programs that were started to help people better be able to afford to buy houses. So it was mortgage insurance that helped lower how much you had to put down as a down payment. It lowered your payments as you keep paying it back. And they had to sort of assess neighborhoods to insure the mortgages. And they basically used this segregation as the basis for their ratings. They decided that all white neighborhoods could get A ratings because they thought that those properties were going to have value. Black neighborhoods got rated B zones. That was the lowest grade. And in the St. Louis area, over 75% of the predominantly black neighborhoods were rated with a D, which meant that the homeowners in those areas couldn't get insurance on their mortgages, which meant they were more expensive. A lot of black people were just shut out of mortgages because they couldn't afford them. And this is what we call redlining. They were really just sort of taken out of the wealth that was being accumulated through housing in the white areas. The white flight to the suburbs was really exacerbated by this because the suburbs was where white people could go and have these expensive houses. And even those black people in a place like Ferguson, which is an inner city suburb, who might have wanted to move further out, couldn't do so. They weren't allowed to buy houses out there, and they couldn't get the mortgages to do so. And that's the legacy we live with today, both in Ferguson and across the country. Today, about 2/3 of Ferguson's residents are black, and the suburbs are mostly white. And that's true across the country. You know, the average city-dwelling white person is in a neighborhood that's 75% white. The average black person lives in a neighborhood that is just 35% white. So we have this legacy of housing policy that has really put up barriers between black and white homeowners that live with us today.
And what's so crazy is I don't think many people. I mean, many people can look at the police violence and looking at unemployment and all of the just the systematic struggles that people of color face. But yeah, you don't even really look at that housing law itself. Just the buying and selling of homes. There was a systematic disadvantage all the way back into the 1920s, where just the actual getting of loans, the loans themselves were much worse off than in different areas. That exists as the baseline for these economic disadvantaged areas.
Exactly, and obviously today those restrictive covenants that said that you couldn't sell properties to black people, those have been done away with. They are not found to be constitutional anymore.
Right.
Black people are supposed to have the same access to mortgages as white people, although we find that there are still lots of discriminatory things going on in housing lending. But even with sort of a more even playing field, we see the legacy of this, because houses have been a real source of wealth for a lot of people. But if you're shut out of the wealthier neighborhoods, and if you're shut out of the lower priced mortgages, you have a harder time building that wealth. And that's why we see that there's an $80,000 wealth gap between the average black household and the average white one, because they have so much less wealth stored in their house. The average black household has about $75,000 in wealth in their home. The average white one has more than $200,000 stored in its home. And, you can trace that directly back to these policies that helped white people become homeowners and left black Americans out.
And so how does that how does that affect the racial makeup of, say, local police forces? Does that have any effect on that at all?
Well, the Ferguson area is really interesting. Many have noted that the police force there is virtually all white. I think there are 3 people of color on their police force, with a community that is predominantly black. And part of that is a holdover from when it used to be more of a mixed population, except that the white people have just sort of held on to the control. And as the demographics have shifted, and more white people flee to the outer suburbs and more black people stay stuck in the inner suburbs, the power hasn't shifted with them. So this is a black community being policed by white police officers, and I think that has also sparked a lot of this tension. The other thing that's going on, too, is that not only have whites fled, but population has fled as well. The city of St. Louis and the surrounding areas have lost population while the suburbs have grown. And it's been a drain on budgets, of course, because then you're getting less tax revenues. And there are a lot of areas that, just like Ferguson, rely on revenue now from tax stops to basically fund public services. I think a quarter of the budget is coming from traffic stops in Ferguson. And the people being stopped are the black population who are being policed by these white cops. So you have this really, I think, volatile mix of segregation with a police force that doesn't look like the population, and all these factors sort of pushing them towards a conflict with each other.